All right, so, like, ready to explore a part of history you probably wouldn't expect. We're talking beer in Egypt.
Yeah, not exactly the first thing that pops into your head, right?
Right. You think pyramids, pharaohs, all that ancient stuff, maybe some strong coffee, but not really, like a cold one.
Definitely not what you picture on those postcards.
Exactly. But that's what makes this deep dive so interesting.
Totally. We're going way beyond the typical Egypt stuff and cracking open this dissertation. It's called Grand Plans in Glass Bottles.
Catchy title.
Right. And it digs into, well, everything, really the economics, the social side, even how technology plays into the history of beer in Egypt. Covers a good chunk of time, to 1880 to 1970.
So we're talking like a period of huge change in Egypt. And for our listeners, I know the source material might sound kind of academic, dissertation and all.
It's one of those dissertations that honestly reads like a detective novel.
No kidding. Okay, so spill the tea. What surprised you the most digging into all this?
The biggest surprise, hands down, is that way before modern beer, like the stuff we're used to, Egypt had a whole brewing culture already. They had this drink, Busa, a traditional fermented drink made with whatever grains they had around.
Okay, so paint us a picture here. What's the Busa scene like?
So imagine, like, late 19th century, you're walking down a bustling Egyptian street, right? You'd probably come across a Busa shop.
Like a local bar, kind of?
Kind of, but way more open air, often, super lively. And apparently they had this distinct aroma.
I bet. Fermentation happening right out in the open. The dissertation actually quotes this British traveler who described these shops as having a, well, let's just say, unique aroma, thanks to the fermenting grain.
Sounds about right. What's fascinating is that Busa wasn't some fancy drink for the elite. It was the drink of the people. Local ingredients, traditional methods, totally different vibe from, like, the mass-produced beers we have today.
Which is where things start to shift, right?
Yeah.
Late 1800s, Egypt's trying to modernize. And part of that is like attracting foreign investment.
Exactly. And with that foreign investment, here come the modern breweries. But think about it. They could just show up with their European beers and expect everyone to be like, cool, sign me up.
Palates were used to Busa, right? That unique flavor.
Absolutely. The dissertation talks about how these breweries, they had to adapt, tweaking their recipes, maybe making the beers a touch sweeter, all to appeal to those palates. It's a classic example of how, even back then, global trends were colliding with local tastes.
It's like globalization 1.0, right? But instead of apps and stuff, it's beer. Speaking of which, for all the techies listening out there, the dissertation gets into the nitty-gritty of how these new breweries brought a wave of like brand new technology into Egypt.
Game changers.
Yeah.
We're talking refrigeration, pasteurization,
Yeah.
things that seem totally normal now, but back then, revolutionary.
Totally. So it's bigger than just beer, right? It's like they're importing a whole new way of thinking about food and drink.
Exactly. But there's a hurdle.
Mhm.
How do you get people excited about these new beers, these new flavors, when they've got Busa in their blood?
Yeah, good question. It's not like they could just slap a label on it and call it a day.
No way. That's where the marketing comes in. And
Yeah.
trust me, this is where things get really interesting.
Hit us with it. How do you sell modern beer to a culture that's got its own very established brewing traditions?
So it becomes about more than just the taste. We're talking early 20th century now. And the beer ads, they're not subtle. They're selling this whole lifestyle, this aspiration, like drink this beer and you're part of the cool cosmopolitan crowd. You've arrived,
So instead of saying, hey, this tastes good, it's, hey, drink this and your life will be better.
basically.
Yeah.
And get this, some ads even claim beer had, like, health benefits.
Come on. That's a stretch even by today's standard.
Right. But back then, they were playing into this idea of beer being scientific, modern, cutting edge. Remember, this is a time when all these new discoveries are happening, changing the world.
So beer is like the iPhone of its day, right? The must-have item if you want to be in the know.
Pretty much. It's all about aligning yourself with this idea of progress.
Which is kind of wild considering the dissertation also mentioned that temperance movements were popping up around the same time in Egypt.
Totally different message, right? It shows you how much Egypt was in this tug of war between tradition and, well, what they saw as modernity.
It's like those two worlds are bumping heads and beer's caught right in the middle.
Exactly. And that clash, it just makes the story even juicier. It's like they're trying to, I don't know, rewrite the rules of the game.
Totally. We're not just talking about a new drink, right? It's a whole new way of thinking about Egypt's place in the world.
And a big part of that is this idea of control.
Control. Okay, connect the dots for us.
So think back to Buza. Every batch is different, right? Different strengths, different flavors. It's unpredictable.
Kind of like charming in a way. But you can see how that wouldn't exactly fly if you're trying to build a global brand.
Exactly. Modernity, at least in this context, is all about standardization, consistency. You can't be the next big thing if your product is all over the place.
So you need control over every step of the process.
Precisely. And that's where Stella beer comes in. Post-World War II, Egypt's going through this huge wave of national pride.
Trying to find its footing in a changing world.
Right. And guess what emerges as an unexpected symbol of that national identity?
Stella.
Bingo.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. But here's the thing.
There's always a but, right?
Always. The story behind Stella's rise, it's not as straightforward as you might think. The dissertation hints at some, well, let's just say, intense power struggles happening behind the scenes.
Okay, so it's not all sunshine and beer gardens. What was going down?
Think corporate espionage, but with more backsheesh. You've got local companies battling it out for control of this, like Golden Goose, that is the Egyptian beer market.
And I'm guessing foreign investors wanted a piece of that action, too.
Oh, absolutely. Heineken, for example, they saw the potential of Stella. So you've got this multi-layered power struggle playing out. Local versus foreign, tradition versus modernity. It's a lot more dramatic than your average beer commercial.
No kidding. It's amazing how something as, I don't know, as simple as beer can become this battleground for all these bigger forces.
It's like a microcosm of what's happening in Egypt at the time. But even with all that drama, Stella does become the beer of Egypt. It gets exported all over, especially within the Arab world.
So does that mean Stella as a tool of soft power?
You got it. Think about it. Egypt, a major player in the region, is now exporting its national beer. It's a way of projecting influence. Sharing Egyptian culture with the world.
It's like instead of sending in the tanks, you send in the beer trucks. A much more delicious form of diplomacy.
Exactly. But then, the 60s hit. Nasser comes to power, and nationalization is the name of the game.
Which, for those who haven't brushed up on their Egyptian history lately, basically means the government's taking control of key industries.
Right. And let me tell you, the dissertation really captures the anxiety of these brewery owners, many of whom were foreign or had ties to foreign companies. Nationalization, that was a threat to everything they'd built.
So what'd they do? Did they just cut their losses and run?
Some did, but others, they weren't ready to give up. They got creative. They restructured their companies, tried to make themselves indispensable to the Egyptian economy. Anything to avoid being nationalized.
High stakes, right. Their livelihoods are on the line. But this is where things get even more layered, right? Because the dissertation also talks about how religion plays into all of this.
Definitely. We can't talk about Egypt without talking about religion. It's a predominantly Muslim country, and alcohol. It's complicated.
So you've got nationalization anxieties, economic competition, and then you add the religious dimension. Talk about a recipe for, well, if not a hangover, then at least some tension.
No kidding. And the dissertation doesn't shy away from that. It actually digs into how different religious groups, Coptic Christians, Muslims, even foreign investors from different faiths, are all caught up in this brewing world.
It's like this microcosm of Egyptian society itself, all swirling around in these beer vats.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that it wasn't always about conflict. Sometimes these different groups, they found common ground, especially when it came to protecting their business interests.
So it's not as simple as drawing lines in the sand and saying, you're on this side, you're on that side.
Not at all. There's cooperation, there's competition, there are alliances that shift like the desert sands. It's complicated, just like real life.
It's like they always say, right, history's never black and white.
More like shades of beer goggles, am I right?
Okay, that's pretty good. But you're right, it's those unexpected alliances, the things you don't see coming, that make it really interesting.
Totally. And it reminds us that history isn't just dates and names in a textbook, It's about people, their choices, their relationships, all that messy stuff.
And sometimes that messy stuff involves beer.
Especially in this case. It makes you realize, like, that bottle of Stella you see at the store, it's more than just a drink. It's got this whole backstory, this whole tangle of economics and politics and culture all mixed up in it.
Like a little time capsule of Egyptian history.
Speaking of which, we can't wrap up this deep dive without talking about that detail from the dissertation, the one about the novel, with the Stella cocktail.
Oh, yeah. I love that little tidbit. It really stuck with me for some reason.
It's so specific, right? Like, in the grand scheme of things, one guy making a mixed drink with Stella, it shouldn't be that important. But it says something, about how Egyptians, especially back then, felt about Stella. Remember, the novel's set in the 60s, right when all this nationalization stuff is going down.
Right, when Stella's becoming the symbol of a new Egypt.
Exactly. And the character who makes this cocktail, he's like this Egyptian intellectual struggling with his identity, his place in this rapidly changing world.
So mixing a drink isn't just mixing a drink. It's like a philosophical statement.
100%. He's taking Stella, this symbol of his national identity, and he's mixing it with all these other ingredients, some local, some foreign. It's like a metaphor for his own experience, trying to blend all these different parts of himself.
Wow. Deep thoughts, brought to you by a Stella cocktail.
You gotta love it when history throws you a curveball like that. But it makes you think, right? Like, even the most everyday things, a beer, a recipe, they can have these hidden layers of meaning, especially when times are changing and people are trying to figure out who they are.
For sure. Well, I don't know about you, but after this deep dive, I'm definitely going to look at my next beer a little differently.
Same here. It's a good reminder that even something as simple as a drink can have this whole backstory.